Hey, Game of Thrones fans, the new year offers new adventures, like being able to get a little bit closer to the world of Westeros like never before. There's a Game of Thrones studio tour that is now open up. And Gabe Saglier, who is the editor for Travel Zoo, joins us with one of Game of Thrones actors, Ian McElhinney, to give us a look at this very exciting experience. Welcome, welcome.
Hey, listen, cool great to be with you. From the heart of Westeros. How lucky am I, huh?
All right, so you are actually in the studio where a lot of the show was filmed?
So listen, Linden Mill Studios, Banbridge, Northern Ireland, 110,000 square feet of space. A lot of the costumes here, this is what the members of the Night's Watch would have been wearing, for example. Any costume, any prop you see here, you would have seen on screen during the 8 seasons of Game of Thrones. And several of the sets, all right, this is, for example, the Great Hall at Winterfell, where Jon Snow was declared King of the North, for example. These sets, as soon as the 8 seasons were done, they left them intact. They've built this super interactive, immersive experience around them. Here's Dragonstone and the infamous map table where so many of those battles were devised. And now as a visitor, this is relatively new, opened up just a couple of months ago last year, but this is the only studio tour of its kind on the planet that takes you into the depths and into the actual worlds of Westeros and those 7 kingdoms. This is beyond the wall. This is the frozen north, where you would have run into perhaps a wildling or a giant or the Night King himself. And one of the crowning pieces, I'd say, of the experience is right here. This is the, of course, the Iron Throne, which is such a centerpiece to the stories behind Game of Thrones. The studio, I've been hanging out here this morning. Folks have been, walking around, and they noticed that, hey, one of the stars of the show is here as well. As you mentioned, Ian McElhinney, who was Barristan the Bold, here in the flesh. And gosh, this has got to be nostalgic for you to be back here after a few years.
Very nostalgic. Yes, it's 12 years, believe it or not, since we first started filming Game of Thrones. And season 1, I personally was then Knight Commander to Robert Baratheon, which meant that I did a lot of my filming in King's Landing. Yeah. And King's Landing, of course, is one of the sets we have here. So it's very special for me to come back and experience that again. But equally, if visitors come, they're in situ. They're where we were. They are there as if they were fellow actors with us. So it's a very particular experience for them.
And I've got to say, Ian is a local. He lives in Belfast, about 30 minutes north of here. And it was not just this studio that was such a prominent part of the making of this show, but the landscape itself, Northern Ireland itself, where they remember the dark hedges known as King's Road. I mean, so much of this landscape, Ian, where you live, where you grew up, big part of the show. That's got to feel great.
It is. It's very special. I mean, Northern Ireland is properly on the map. Largely, it has to be said, as a consequence of Game of Thrones and the exposure that is given to us. And I mean, we're very lucky because we do live in a beautiful part of the world. We have wonderful beaches, wonderful landscape and seaside, beautiful countryside, rolling hills galore, So it is very lovely, and it's a pleasure to be able to showcase it, if you like, to the world.
I mean, it makes sense when you see those scenes that it would be such a prominent part of the show. So about 30 minutes south of Belfast, about an hour 20 north of Dublin. So when I landed in Dublin, it was an easy drive north, gorgeous drive north. So super accessible, super easy to do. It's a self-guided tour, which is great. Yeah. So you can take your time. You can spend as many hours as you want here. Great dining, great exclusive retail opportunities here as well for Game of Thrones fans. So definitely something to do this year as you begin to map out your travels.
I don't think I've ever heard of a show like that, a movie, whatever, that has actually kept the sets in the studio where they've done, and then obviously turned it into a tourist attraction like that.
It is fascinating, and certainly this is done in conjunction with and blessings from HBO that allowed so much of this to remain in place. But as you were saying, so many of these props, for example, that were almost designed to your hand, if you will.
They were tailored. We had tailored props. Every single sword was individualized. The costumes were individual costumes. I mean, nobody replicated anybody else. Perhaps if you were one of the Unsullied, you were replicating each other. That's rather different because you were nameless. But each and every character had something distinctive that was theirs and theirs alone and was not replicated elsewhere.
It was fantastic. Gentlemen, thank you so very much for showing us that and just having a chance to chat. And yeah, hopefully can make it to Northern Ireland there. Appreciate it. Have a wonderful, wonderful 2023. All right, and for more information on the Game of Thrones studio tour, of course, you can go to salive.com and click on the As Seen on SA Live tab or scan that QR code right there at the bottom of the screen.